do have a guest, Mr. Caleb Maupin, who's just been chilling out these days, taking it easy, taking it light. Caleb, how are you?
I'm good. How about yourself?
Good. I know you've been making the rounds. You've been everywhere this week. And this is because your book seems to have been banned by Amazon for all effects and purposes. So what happened?
Well, I wrote this book. I wrote it in 2020. It was published on August 31st in 2020, and it's about Kamala Harris. It was right after she had become the vice presidential candidate. I decided to write this book about a lot of research I had been doing on her, etc. So it's been for sale, and I sold between 2020 and on Monday, I sold about 595 copies of it. So not a huge seller. It made a little bit of a splash. It got a review in the Morning Star, which is the communist daily newspaper of the United Kingdom. It got a review in a couple newspapers in India, which totally surprised me. But I guess they watch RT in India. It's English language, so that they knew me from there, and Kamala's mother is from India, so that's where that happened. But other than that, it didn't really create a huge splash. I spoke to some web conferences about it, whatever. Not a big deal. 4 years have gone by. And then Kamala got the nomination. She ended up, Joe Biden stepped down on Sunday. Monday, the media was treating Kamala Harris as the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party. So I figured, okay, there'll be a bit of a boost in sales. And it did sell a little bit on Monday. And then at 7:26 p.m. Eastern time, I received an email. And it said that there was a problem with one of my books and that I would need to change the cover art. And I thought, well, that's weird. There hasn't been a cover. I checked, and it was the Kamala Harris book. And I checked because there hadn't been an issue with the cover in the last 4 years. It was, individually designed. The name of the designer is on the original edition. His name's Arthur Porter. He lives in Arizona. He's a friend of mine. And it's original artwork, but okay, there's an issue with the cover. All right. And I figured I want to get this out there because Kamala Harris is the talk of the town. So I just put a blank generic cover following one of their templates on it and resubmitted, rejected. And so I woke up in the morning, Tuesday morning, resubmitted, rejected. Every time I would send it in, about an hour later, it would be right back to me. And I thought, this is very, very strange. What in the world is going on here? So, I raised the alarm, and a lot of people smelled foul play. Max Blumenthal, others have spoken out. A lot of people from all across the political spectrum. This seems like pretty blatant censorship. So we put it on Lulu, and Lulu carried it until Thursday. And it's still on Lulu, but if you go to try and buy it, it won't let you process your credit card. If you buy it via PayPal or with your credit card, it says the transaction just won't process. So right now I'm selling the PDF version of it on Gumroad, which is a website where you can sell electronic files. And I will say we've sold over 1,000 in the last week. This is
great. Jake, you want to throw up that link?
Yeah, this has created a huge amount of interest in the book. This isn't something I wrote for this election. I wrote it 4 years ago, and it's been out there all this time. The information in it is not unique. I quote Reason Magazine and their studies of Kamala Harris. I quote, Donald Harris, her father, his essays. I quote Kamala Harris's autobiography. it's not like I have some deep inside scoop of information. It's pretty weird that this got, just scooped up by Amazon all of a sudden. And then, Lulu did the same thing pretty quickly afterwards. So if you want it now, it's on Gumroad, and a lot of people are reading it and loving it.
Isn't Lulu kind of an alternative press for authors like yourself? Amazon's not a shock, but that seems very strange that they would have pulled it.
It does, and it's still listed. You cannot process your credit card transaction if you go to buy it, which is very, very strange. As of now, Lulu, the only reason that they've given me is they've said, well, so many people tried to buy it. Maybe there's an issue with the system or something. I don't buy that. I have a hard time believing that one. Generally booksellers want to make money.
Well, yeah.
A lot of people buying their products is something they tend to be happy about and want to enable to happen. And the fact that it hasn't been fixed, and I continue to get people tweeting at me, tried to buy it on Lulu, was unable to buy it on Lulu. The other thing that was weird is when they took it down from Amazon.
Especially an alternative press like that. Like, how many hits do they get? where they could potentially sell tens of thousands of books.
Right. The other thing that's weird is when they took it down from Amazon, occasionally if you sell on Amazon, there'll be a bit of a snafu with a book that, or something. What they generally do is the page remains up. It just says, this is currently unavailable. Title currently unavailable. Not this one. All the links leading to the Amazon page are completely blank. It just says it's been completely scrubbed from Amazon. Now, you can still read the reviews on Goodreads that it got, and it got overwhelmingly positive reviews on Goodreads.com. Those reviews are still up there, and you can read what people had to say about it. They all loved it. So it looks very, very, very much like censorship because it happened the day after, or I guess the day that she became the presumptive nominee, the day after Biden dropped out. So at this point, I'm appreciating the fact that so many people are reading it, and it seems like this has backfired. But I still have questions about, how this happened. Why? I mean, Max Blumenthal suggested that this could have come from an order from the White House because this matches kind of the way a lot of COVID related books were removed. So this is certainly something to be concerned about. Now, a number of people have said to me, this could be an FEC violation. Because if books critical of one candidate are being removed while there's a million I Hate Donald Trump books on Amazon. And you'll notice there are not very many books critical of Kamala Harris on Amazon or that have been published in general. I mean, there's one book, it's called Amateur Hour. It was printed by the Washington Times Press last year, I believe, or maybe it was earlier this year. I did read it and I learned a lot from it. But there's not much that's critical of her. There's not much about her at all. And that's what's so weird, right? With Barack Obama, we knew everything there was to know about him. His mom, his dad, his pastor, his school in Indonesia, his stepfather, everything. But with Kamala Harris, we just know that she's been in Congress. She's the vice president. And now they expect us to all just go to the polls and make her president. And the media has been in overdrive doing, really fake and lacking in substance stories about how much everyone loves her, informing us that we love her. So we should love her because we already love her.
Right. Well, it's also very strange. We were talking about this before we came on. I've read all of it except the last 10 pages, which I know that's where the big reveal is. But I'll get to that later. But having read it mostly, I don't get it. There's plenty of information. There are plenty of articles about the things you cover there. And you're much more concerned in this book with her historical context than with the specifics of her career and biography. You get into that, but it seems like you were much more concerned with placing her within the broader sweep of post-war American politics and its trends. Why pull something like that? Like there's no bombshell there. There's no, she used to deal heroin in the Tenderloin. There's nothing like that in there. Why would they target this book?
Yeah, well, I did not write this. This book is not a partisan hit piece on Kamala Harris. I'm above that, and that wouldn't have been fun for me to write. It would have been boring. I used her as an example to make three major political points. The first essay, it's an essay in three parts. The first one is about how she is a product of the Berkeley New Left. Her parents attended UC Berkeley. They met at protests. Her father is a Marxist economist, and they were most likely in some kind of communist organization when they met. I'm sure there's an FBI file somewhere that says which communist group they were in, whether it was the Progressive Labor Party or the Socialist Workers Party or one of those groups. We don't know which one in particular, but they met.
Well, you also, while you're on that was my next question, actually, just not to break your flow, but you talk a lot about the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the influence that it had on the left that she would have grown up in. So can you talk a little about that in the overall context of her upbringing?
Right. Well, McCarthyism, we all know about that. The Communist Party was outlawed and crushed. The Rosenbergs got executed. Pretty awful time. But McCarthyism kind of turned into a vehicle through which a lot of middle-class elements were kind of rising up against the American establishment. Joe McCarthy was going after Voice of America, the propaganda outlet, and Radio Free Europe. And Joe McCarthy was accusing the army of being communist. And a lot of middle-class kind of people were using the anti-communism to kind of rally against the more liberal elites in the establishment, like the Rockefellers, who had funded, Planned Parenthood and, the work of Alfred Kinsey and others. And so there was this kind of, McCarthyism became this kind of middle-class right-wing populist movement. And so that's when, Joe McCarthy, suddenly the media turned on him. He drank himself to death, etc. And then starting from like the late 50s, there was a program. It really escalated. It started earlier, but it really escalated in the late 50s, where the American government was covertly subsidizing and arranging for the Ford Foundation, for the Rockefeller think tanks, and others to subsidize left-wing activism in the United States. I think McGeorge Bundy, who served in the Kennedy administration, and others, there was covert funding for leftist politics. And the main program that carried it out was something called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And this it looked like a nonprofit or whatever, but it was actually set up by the CIA. And it was to promote free thought and independence. And it was funding a lot of people who called themselves communists and socialists, but they were against the Soviet Union. They were against Soviet communism. They were against the old communist parties. And while at the same time they were criticizing the Pentagon and criticizing American consumerism, they were also doing kind of cancel culture against the intellectuals who were loyal to the Soviet Union, were loyal to communism. And they were engaging in this kind of like, you can be on neither side. You can be against the communists and you can be against the American government. And it was actually being paid for by the American government. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom program is where left-wing politics in America started really being reinvented in the lead up to what became the hippie movement of the 60s. Susan Sontag, her essays first appeared in CIA-funded publications like Partisan Review. In addition to that, you had, I talk about Hannah Arendt. She writes this book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, which I read when I was in college, and it's pushed.
Why do you want to make Chris Hedges cry?
What's that?
Why do you want to make Chris Hedges cry?
Oh, well, there you go. but Eichmann in Jerusalem, you read that essay, and it looks like kind of a critique of conformity. But what it's really kind of saying is that deep down, average people are all potential Nazis and need to be controlled, and that Nazism and fascism is just populism, right? And that, and then that matches what Susan Sontag later said. She basically proclaimed communism to be nothing but the most effective form of fascism. And it's this kind of this anti-populism, this narrative of leftism that is not against capitalism. It's not against our economic system. It's against conformity. It's against the military. It's about protecting intellectuals from the vulgar mob that would organize to try and bother them. And the head of the Congress for Cultural Freedom program was Irving Kristol, who later became the father of neoconservatism. So not only did he help reinvent leftist politics, he later, helped reinvent right-wing politics in the 1970s as the kind of the godfather of neoconservatism. His son is Bill Kristol of the Weekly Standard. So politics was being reinvented, and the Bay Area in particular, where Kamala Harris grew up, was kind of ground zero for that. There was also a parallel CIA program going on during these years, which is now public record. It's called Project MK Ultra. And that was where the CIA was trying to develop mind control. And they were going around and getting people on LSD and hallucinogens. There was Operation Midnight Climax in the Bay Area, where they were going around and dropping acid in people's drinks. They were going to brothels and, tying people to beds and putting them on acid to see what would happen. They were doing all kinds of things to do that. And Kamala Harris grew up in leftist politics in San Francisco in the 60s. Which was, yes, a very left-wing environment, but it was left-wing politics that was being remolded by the CIA. And that kind of explains where we're at politically right now, especially in relation to the whole woke thing and what's going on with that. So that's the first essay. Second essay is called Psychology Behind Politics. And that is about Kamala Harris and her personality. And I talk about how the personality of various presidents and leaders lines up and how Kamala Harris is estranged from her father. And there's a parallel life story and a lot of figures you find in a particular wing of American politics associated with the Hillary Clinton State Department, and how that's not generally the kind of psychology that communism and Marxism have tried to appeal to. And the third essay is called The Geopolitical Stage. And that's where I talk about Tulsi Gabbard going after Kamala Harris, and Tulsi Gabbard and who she's tied to, and how there are divisions there was division within the Obama administration between Hillary Clinton's allies and those that were opposed to what she was doing. And that's why, John Kerry, when John Kerry became Secretary of State in Obama's second term, you'll notice U.S. foreign policy dramatically shifted during that time. The Hillary Clinton years, the first term of Obama was about spreading chaos and revolution. The second term of Obama, with John Kerry running the State Department, was all about signing deals with countries, establishing relations with Cuba, the Iran nuclear deal, the FARC negotiations in Colombia, etc. And that there are a number of people in the Pentagon who are very afraid of what the results of another Arab Spring would be. And that Kamala Harris has been primed and selected by the people who ran the State Department under Hillary Clinton. And their goal is they want global revolution and chaos to spread what they call the open international system. They want, permanent revolution, I guess you could call it, but, not in the Trotskyite sense, but in the, free market global capitalism sense. And their enemy and their target is what they call populism. And they see Donald Trump as an expression of populism, but also Xi Jinping in China, also Putin in Russia, also, the Iranian government, etc. And they see populism as the enemy, and they see globalism and internationalism and mass uprisings fomented by social media as the way to bring it. And I talk about that. And Tulsi Gabbard represents those who are very concerned about that. So those are the three parts of it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to read a little from that, and then Tusker, your question will perfectly come out of that intro. So this I found really fascinating, and we'll come back to this because the book does. The biggest banks, the 4 super major oil companies, and the Silicon Valley tech giants all incarnate a powerful, globally oriented liberal faction that opposes him meaning Trump. They seek to make the USA more racially inclusive and to destabilize anti-imperialist countries in the name of spreading human rights. They favor a more social democratic model, perhaps involving universal basic income to stabilize U.S. society, as the population is transitioned to lower living standards across the board. They favor reduction of consumption in the name of fighting global warming and further integrating the U.S. economy into a global market. While Trump's faction focuses on increasing its short-term profits, the globalist faction that Trump decries focuses on maintaining stability while gradually implementing long-term goals. Pouring billions of dollars into research and social engineering, the upper faction of U.S. capital favors gradually and carefully reducing living standards, eliminating anti-imperialist governments around the world, transitioning to a more open global economy, normalizing police-state repression in everyday life, and reducing the human population. All right, so Tusker, your question?
Yeah, sure. So in that third chapter, you mention that in reality, what we're actually experiencing in politics is really more of a fight at the top. And it's between different factions, and that some of those factions are trying to hold off one faction that they see as particularly dangerous. And so I'm kind of wondering, what's the nature of that faction that they want to kind of keep out of power? What's its class interests? And how is it so dangerous for ordinary working people?
Well, there's a lot written about this. I certainly didn't develop this understanding. There's a very good book called The Rich and the Ultra Rich by Ferdinand Lundberg that I think was written in the 1930s. And it talked about, who was supporting Roosevelt and who was opposing him. And then Carroll Quigley, who was the mentor of Bill Clinton, he wrote a very good book called The Anglo-American Establishment. And he wrote a much longer book called Tragedy and Hope, kind of making this understanding. And then later you have, a very good book that I often reference called The Yankee and Cowboy War by Carl Oglesby. And in the early 60s and in the 70s, a number of people in the United States became aware of the fact that among the American rich, there were 2 factions. Carl Oglesby calls them the Yankees and the Cowboys, but Carroll Quigley spoke of the Anglo-American establishment. I think some of the LaRouche people, they talk about the British Empire, et cetera, or the Rockefeller Republicans or whatever. But there is a faction among the rich and powerful in the United States that is more concerned with social engineering and staying at the top in the long run than they are with short-term profits. And people trace it back to the round table group established by the will of Cecil Rhodes, who was, it's Rhodesia. And Zimbabwe used to be Rhodesia, is the British colonialist. And that there is a faction of the ultra-rich that have very much been interested in how do we stay at the top permanently? And how do we impose a lot of control to make sure we don't have upheavals and revolutions and uprisings? And if that means that we have to spend a lot of money in the short term in order to do it, that's fine. But it's better to have stability so that we stay at the top indefinitely than it is to just have our profits shoot up in the short term. And, you can go back to, the Roosevelt administration. It was pretty clear that Roosevelt, he was aligned with the Rockefeller family. He was aligned with some wealthy people, but the National Association of Manufacturers very much opposed him because he supported unions in the factories and he passed, Social Security and unemployment insurance, and that they saw him as cutting into their profits, whereas there were some more strategic oriented of the elite who had a different orientation. And this is a push and pull. And after the Second World War, the military-industrial complex really exploded. The U.S. government was spending so much on bombs and tanks and weapons that gave a boost to these lower-level capitalists who were in on that. And they were very anti-communist already because they didn't like labor unions, et cetera. But now they were making lots of money with tanks and bombs and weapons. So what we call the right wing now, the John Birch Society, Barry Goldwater, et cetera, what we call the right wing goes back. It's those lower level capitalists that weren't, on board with this overall social engineering agenda that the ultra rich might have. And I think, you can interpret the political crisis of the 60s and 70s as this disagreement. But, by the 80s, the Soviet Union was getting ready to fall. U.S. society was restabilizing. And Ronald Reagan famously said, we're all friends after 6 o'clock, meaning the fight was over. Right? In the 80s and 90s, things were pretty normal. But after the financial crisis of 2008, the fight reopened. And that, many people have commented that Obama is a student of Zbigniew Brzezinski. He studied at Columbia University. And the people that really haven't had the upper hand in American politics since the Carter administration got power back under Barack Obama. And Donald Trump was opposing them, and those folks have picked Kamala Harris. And that, again, these are, all, when you talk about class interests, these are all capitalists. These are all people that sit at the top of a global imperialist system, but they have different goals, and they're invested in different countries. I mean, a lot of it just gets back to the fact Russia is an oil exporting country, and the Rockefellers and the DuPonts, they're all tied into oil. Whereas a lot of these lower level capitalists, they're manufacturers. And what country is a big manufacturing? It's the factory of the world, China. So, industrial manufacturers don't like China. Oil bankers don't like Russia. They both don't like them both, but there's a difference in agendas.
Well, one thing that I think changed since you wrote it in 2020 is you identify Silicon Valley as kind of being a block with that Rockefeller globalist group. And now there's kind of been this split where you have the Elon tech people, the Peter Thiel people, the J.D. Vances going over to the lower capital, even though they're quite wealthy. Elon, the wealthiest person in the world. So that Silicon Valley faction seems to have split since you wrote this.
Well, the Silicon Valley was created by American intelligence, and there is no question about that. That's widely acknowledged. I think, Al Gore, he got attacked when he was running for president because he said, I invented the internet, or was misquoted as saying that. And what he was referring to was the fact that it was a decision by the American government that this was something they could do. They could, invest a lot of money in computers and make the United States the center of the computer revolution. And the Soviet Union, even though they had amazing breakthroughs in computers, they were the first people in outer space, they developed their own home computer system, they just didn't have the resources to invest in it the same way the United States did. And so, you can read about how the NSA and the CIA and other intelligence agencies were very key in creating Microsoft and Google and Amazon and IBM and all the corporations that we now identify as Silicon Valley. And that late 70s, early 80s explosion in computer technology that put the United States at the center of that. It actually matches what was advocated by Zbigniew Brzezinski. He, as far back as 1970, he wrote a book about the technotronic era, and how control of information was how the world could be, quote, Americanized. And so this is what those folks have always wanted. Now, what I find to be very interesting, I talked about how Al Gore, he said, we invented the internet, I invented the internet. What's interesting is that Al Gore also had a spiritual advisor who was like his psychic, and her name was Marilyn Ferguson, and he paid her lots of money, and she came over and did readings, etc., for the Gore family. And Marilyn Ferguson, you can read all about her. Her big book is called The Aquarian Conspiracy, and it was a best-selling book in the 1980s, all about how there was a big revolution coming, and it wasn't pro-communist or anti-communist. It was just about human awakening and human enlightenment, and the world was going to get back into balance with Mother Nature, and we were going to get overpopulation under control. And yeah, you look at that, that's some scary stuff. And that she's linked to, and she praises endlessly in that book, the Stanford Research Institute, which we know it was ground zero of a lot of this CIA programs involving MK Ultra and like weird research they did into psychics and mind control and all of that. And that was where Marilyn Ferguson came out of. So it's not surprising that she would be the one trusted enough to be the psychic advisor of Al Gore. But Al Gore is also talking about how, they invented the internet, and they very much tried to have the U.S. government facilitate the rise of these corporations. And I think that's important to discuss as well. And that's where Silicon Valley came from. But let's be real, Silicon Valley has a lot of self-made men in it. It has a lot of libertarians in it, right?
Right.
And so the personality of your average Silicon Valley tech bro is not the same as the overall agenda of the people who own the big tech monopolies. I think that's the distinction that needs to be made.
So now you suggest that Biden did not want, well, you say straight out, he did not want Kamala Harris. And you share some interesting facts, like that she was not originally listed as the VP. Can you talk about that a little?
Oh, that's very clear if you look at the chain of events. So Biden named a date that he was going to announce his running mate. And he said it was going to be a woman of color. And immediately, all the mainstream talk shows and all of that say, it's got to be Kamala. It's got to be Kamala. But they're not naming Kamala. They're not naming Kamala. And that date comes and it goes. And there's still no nominee. And it's 10 days past that date. And he still has not named his VP nominee. Karen Bass is named, as possibly being the person. And then all of a sudden, the New York Times reveals that she went to Cuba when she was a young person. She was on the Vince Ramos brigades, and that becomes leaked. Oh, she can't be trusted. She's a Cuba sympathizer or whatever. It's funny that just came out then, and who might have this information or whatever. But regardless, that gets revealed, right? And Susan Rice, there's some talk of Susan Rice. And then the schedule for the Democrat National Convention comes out, and it's got VP candidate one place on the schedule, and it's got Kamala Harris another place on the schedule. And then Kamala Harris unfollows Joe Biden on Twitter, and everyone notices this, and they're like, what's going on here? 6 hours later, she's named as the nominee. And I am very convinced. It is hard for me to believe that all that chain of events does not indicate that Biden was doing everything he could to not select her. And one fact that must be pointed out, and I've met Tara Reid a number of times, I consider her a friend, is that that Kamala Harris has said during the campaign that she believed all the allegations of sexual assault, sexual misconduct against Joe Biden. And to this day, she has never recanted that. And that's quite interesting as well. She says that she believed the allegations against Joe Biden. The other thing that's weird is you'll remember that convention happened during
just real fast, Caleb. I'm trying to remember if I'm correct on this. I thought whenever Tara Reid, she went to some women's organization, I thought Kamala Harris was tied into that organization.
Yes, there has been, from what Tara Reid has said publicly on podcasts and such, there has been communication between Tara Reid and the Kamala Harris campaign. So that's very weird. The other thing that was said that then happened was that, you remember this convention happened during the lockdown. Right. There was not a big crowd there and all of that. But Kamala Harris is giving her speech and she's talking about how she was a prosecutor and all of that. And then she says the line that she says in her speech is she says, I know a predator when I see one. And then there's this awkward pause in her speech. Like if you read her speech, she would be talking about Trump, except it was awkward. It was like that was like a subtle threat, like possibly, she knew what, she wasn't just talking necessarily about Donald Trump. I mean, it's not clear. Again, we're engaging in an element of what you might call shadow boxing or something like that. We don't really know what went on. But the fact that that Biden was 10 days late picking his VP, the fact that Kamala Harris unfollowed him and wasn't originally on the schedule, and the fact that since Kamala Harris has taken office, her staff are considered to be completely toxic and she can't keep them. Right. People don't want to work for her. The Biden administration cannot stand, you know, the Harris staff and the people who work in her office, right? And they have a reputation. I mean, all the stuff that's come out of her office over the last 4 years, none of this is at all surprising.
All right. So that's a perfect segue. You spend a lot of time talking about her as somebody who is just really filled with hatred and a desire for vengeance, really almost as the apotheosis of everything that the CIA and the Cultural Congress have been trying to turn the left into. Just a manifestation of grievance and identity politics for their own sake, and victimhood as a form of moral righteousness. So something you keep coming back to, and I'm sure our audience will have seen this, but whoever gets tired of Kamala Harris laughing about locking up the parents of truants. So we'll take a look at that and then discuss this theory.
Education is tantamount to a crime. Standing here, were it not for the education I received. And I know many of us will say the same thing. And I believe a child going without an education is tantamount to a crime. So I decided I was going to start prosecuting parents for truancy. Well, this was a little controversial in San Francisco. And frankly, my staff went bananas. They were very concerned because we didn't know at the time whether I was going to have an opponent in my re-election race. But I said, look, I'm done. This is a serious issue, and I've got a little political capital, and I'm going to spend some of it. And this is what we did. We recognized that in that initiative, as a prosecutor and law enforcement, I have a huge stick. The school district has got a carrot. Let's work in tandem around our collective objective and goal, which is to get those kids in school. So, to that end, on my letterhead, now let me tell you something about my letterhead. When you're the DA of a major city in this country, usually the job comes with a badge. And there is often an artistic rendering of said badge on your stationery. So I sent a letter out on my letterhead to every parent in the school district, outlining the connection that was statistically proven between elementary school truancy, high school dropouts, who will become a victim of crime, and who will become a perpetrator of crime. We sent it out to everyone. A friend of mine actually called me and he said, Kamala, my wife got the letter. She freaked out. She brought all the kids into the living room, held up the letter, said, if you don't go to school, Kamala's going to put you and me in jail.
That's cracking her up. That is, if the politics thing doesn't work out, she might have a future at the Improv.
Well, the thing about that clip in particular, right? Pay attention to the facial expressions, the body language, some of the language that she uses about her big stick. She's got this big stick that she's going to use and all of that. This is not a healthy person. There's some very, very dangerous sadism there, I guess you could say. The other thing that I think is important about that clip, and I point this out, is she starts out by talking about herself. And if you watch that clip, look how her face goes down when she talks about, I wouldn't be anywhere, and it's tantamount to a crime. She's got this self-pity that just comes over her. Kamala talks about her childhood more than any other politician in modern times that I've ever seen. They have T-shirts. That little girl was me, 10-year-old Kamala Harris on them. The latest thing, we're supposed to, we can't make fun of her laugh because she was bullied for that when she was a kid, so that therefore we can't make fun of her laugh. We're all just bad people if we make fun of that, hysterical cackle that she does, just the endless amount of the world was unfair to little Kamala Harris. Awful things happened to her, which I'm sure did, right? I mean, I'm not trying to belittle anything that happened to her. But that seems to be a motivating factor. Kamala Harris, I'm not going to say her age, but she is well over 50 years old. And for her to be talking about her childhood and invoking her childhood endlessly as she does, That is very, very unhealthy. And that seems to be what gives her license to do a lot of the awful things that she has done. And, you know, first of all, let me talk about, you know, and they're trying to scrub all the bad things that she's done from Google searches and stuff. That particular clip, you know, there's a number of places on Wikipedia and other places where I found it edited to say, oh, well, there were no parents that were ever jailed for truancy. And then if you look at the source doesn't say that. Right. Yeah. And they have tried their hardest to just scrub any record of this reality. But we can go over the facts. Right. You know, 2004, Kevin Cooper was hours away from getting the death penalty by lethal injection. And she, you know, she tries to block evidence, DNA evidence from being acquired. And the DNA evidence is acquired. You know, the execution is stopped. In addition to that, 2010, you have the drug lab scandal, which is, you want to talk about something unforgivable. I mean, it's just awful. This drug lab is turning over false positive results. People are, you know, testing positive for drugs when they didn't use them. And over 1,000 cases in California are dismissed. People are let out of jail because of this drug lab scandal. I mean, can you imagine this? People are, you know, on trial, possibly going to jail. They take a drug test and the drug test says positive and they didn't use drugs and they end up in jail or pleading guilty because of that. I mean, she violated the rights of at least 1,000 people, according to the California courts. They called her out. Reason Magazine, I must say, has done great research onto what she was as California State Attorney General. 2014, after she was reelected California State Attorney General, her office starts arguing against releasing prisoners on the grounds that they need their cheap labor. They need their cheap labor because their cheap labor is just a valuable source. You know, prisoners, you can pay them 8 cents to 37 cents an hour. Whereas, you know, law-abiding citizens, you got to pay them benefits and decent wages. They get union protection. I mean, what is this? We don't want this, right? Let's just, you know, use prisoners to put out fires, use prisoners to pick up garbage on the highway. That's particularly odious. Also, 2013, she's speaking at the Chicago Ideas Forum. She starts strutting around the stage, making fun of those who protest mass incarceration. Build more schools, less jails. Build more schools, less jails. It's just so, you know, those protesters, those people that oppose millions of people being locked up. Oh, they're so annoying. Oh, they're just so obnoxious. And they're, you know, they're not dealing with the fact that she's got to have padlocks on her door. And I mean, this is a very, very vengeful person who's very indifferent to what her actions do and the impact that they have on other people. Right. She really has no qualms about harming other people. And again, in that clip where she's like, you know, I wouldn't be anywhere without my education. It's not about helping those kids. Now, let's think about a situation, right? Obviously, if a child is being neglected and their parent is not making sure they get to school, that's a problem that needs to be dealt with. Is the solution to then throw their parents in jail and then they go into the foster system? Obviously not. But it's not about helping those kids. It's about taking revenge on those parents. It's about, you know, little Kamala, and that little girl was hers. And now she's going to take revenge for whatever happened to little Kamala Harris. And it's really, really unhealthy. And she has given herself license to engage in all kinds of very immoral and cruel acts and be indifferent to the results. Now, I, in the book, say it's pretty clear that that has something to do with a man that no one's talking about at all named Donald Harris. And that is her father. Her mother is now deceased, but her father is 85 years old and he lives in Jamaica. And he denounced her 2020 presidential campaign. He's estranged from her. He wants nothing to do with her. His entire Jamaican family denounced her. And there's a lot there. And the fact that her father doesn't like her and that she doesn't like her father and all of that, I think has a lot to do with the desire for vengeance, and particularly who she has doled it out against. Largely African-American men, because the rise in mass incarceration, as she was rising up the ranks of the California criminal justice system in the 90s, who was getting locked up? Black men like her father.
Yeah, you get into this very interesting kind of psychoanalysis of how the last 4 presidents have had kind of parallel lives or similar family dynamics. And the point you make is that their family experience left them needy for approval. And that's part of why the establishment or the deep state, what have you, chose them. Because they had easy buttons to push.
Yeah, and that sounds a little like conspiratorial and tinfoil hatty if you think about it. They don't care about my personality or your personality or your personality. But if we were president of the United States, our personality would be quite important because the decisions we make mean billions of dollars and maybe millions of lives on the line. And it is interesting to see that there's a parallel. So Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, both of them have a single mother. They don't know their fathers. Their single mother gets married. And they have a stepfather who abuses, and there's domestic violence against their mother. Eventually, the stepfather marriage ends, and they're still with their mother. Both of them, at a young age, learn that they're very, very good, charismatic speakers, and that they've always kind of been there for their mom, right? They're the one cheering up their mom, getting their mom through hardship, and their mothers push them to succeed, and they both end up in Ivy League schools, and they both end up being president of the United States. Interesting parallel. And their abilities are also very similar. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama are very good at being radical in tone and moderate in deed and words, right? When Barack Obama was speaking in 2008, you thought it was going to be a revolution. I mean, it was the most amazing thing. But if you actually listen to what he was saying standard Democratic Party liberal stuff. Bill Clinton also, he was fighting for the working man. But if you actually listen to what he was saying, it was actually quite a move to the right in terms of economic policies and stuff from what the Democratic Party was doing. And he set up the Democrat Leadership Council that was like purging the Democratic Party of your Bernie Sanders types. And so, but they're both very good at getting people excited and getting, being there and cheering people up. And it's all about hope, right? Bill Clinton, a little place called hope, right? Barack Obama, hope and change, and it's all about, right? They're very good at that. Now, Donald Trump and George W. Bush also have a similar life story in that they both had very high achieving fathers. They knew their fathers, and their fathers were a big deal, right? George Herbert Walker Bush, CIA director, president of the United States. And Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father, this huge real estate magnate, big property owner in New York City. And both of them, they have multiple brothers, and both of them are viewed as the screw up son. Right? Jeb Bush was the one that the Bush parents really liked. He was the one that they all thought would be president. George W., on the other hand, didn't do so well in school and had a drinking problem and got arrested at a football game for rowdy behavior and had a cocaine problem and started a baseball team that didn't go anywhere. And, that's George W. Bush, right? Donald Trump, as we know, his father sent him to military boarding school because he was such a discipline problem. And he spent his 20s as a party boy. He talked about how getting venereal disease was his own Vietnam, et cetera. And that, he was not viewed as the high achieving son of the Trump family, but he comes into adulthood with something to prove, and that Donald Trump is very desperate to get his face in the media and to show that he's very successful and that he's very rich. And that's how he becomes kind of an icon in the 80s and 90s in New York City media, because he's out there showing everyone how rich he is, etc. Both George W. Bush and Donald Trump come into adulthood with this kind of damage as something to prove. So it's a different story that they knew their fathers, but they have something to prove. And so that's quite interesting when you then look at Kamala Harris and her story, because it lines up with Samantha Power. It lines up with Amy Klobuchar, and it's quite interesting. Samantha Power also had a father. The parents split apart.
Just explain to our audience who Samantha Power is.
Samantha Power was the United Nations ambassador under Barack Obama, was an advisor in the Barack Obama White House, who was very key for pushing for military intervention in Libya. Her husband is Cass Sunstein, who's also a prominent advisor in the Barack Obama administration. Samantha Power has this same story. Amy Klobuchar has a similar story, and Amy Klobuchar also becomes a prosecutor around the same time period, and she's jailing people. And actually, Amy Klobuchar's trademark when she was the prosecutor, her trademark was that she would use what they called gang experts. And this is a really dirty thing that these prosecutors used to do. But some African-American man would be on trial for some crime, and they would bring in an expert witness who did not know anything about the crime, but was really good at telling horror stories that would scare the crap out of jurors, right? About the awful things that gangs do. Gangs are not nice, obviously. And so they would get one of these gang experts on the witness stand, and he would tell a bunch of stories about awful things that gangs do, blood and gore and crime and all of that. And these juries would sit there and they'd be horrified. And the subtle message is, if you acquit this guy, he might go out there and do something like this again, and juries would convict. And you have to remember, the other thing to remember about the criminal justice system, that, again, a lot of people think they know about the U.S. legal system by watching police shows, and that is not reality, right? In the United States, if you go to trial, that is the dramatic exception. Okay, very rarely does anyone go to trial. Almost everyone makes a plea bargain. If someone goes to trial, something's off. Now in California,
because
they
the
have the three
prosecutors
strike law.
load you up with charges to terrify you.
Yeah, it's like 95% of cases make a plea deal. Now in California, you have the 3 strikes law. So if it's your third strike, if it's a felony, you're going to jail for 25 years. So, you would obviously want to go to trial for your third strike. If you're very wealthy, you can afford to spend 2 years going to court and having court dates and paying attorneys and all of that. But very rarely do people ever go to trial. So if somebody is going through the difficulty of actually going to trial in the United States, there's a very good chance they're doing it because they really believe that they are innocent. And yet the conviction rate is astronomically high. I believe the Bronx in New York City has one of the lowest in the country, and it's a 2/3 conviction rate. So, and that's one of the lowest in the country. Pretty standard convictions. I mean, almost all trials have convictions. So, things are stacked against the defendants very, very much. And these prosecutors, and as somebody, I used to go to court with police brutality victims in Cleveland before I moved to New York City. And I would see how these prosecutors would operate. And it is pretty vicious. There was a police brutality case I worked on, where, there was a neighbor who went in to testify, against the police officers. And as she was leaving the courthouse, and this is like an elderly woman in her 70s, the police grab her and shove her against the wall and all of that for a warrant with somebody who has the same name as her, who's like 19 years old. They knew it wasn't her, but they just wanted to retaliate against her. How dare she testify? And the prosecutor is standing there and laughs about it and says, well, she deserved it. This is how they operate, right? And that these criminal prosecutors are very, very vicious. There's a real indifference to other people and their suffering. And that's Kamala Harris. And it takes a special kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, evil, psychopathy. I mean, it's not really psychopathy because there's feeling there. Sociopaths are just kind of indifferent and emotionless. Kamala Harris is very emotional. It's about her. I think about when you talk about narcissism, right? Where does the word narcissist come from? It's the story of Narcissa, right? Or Narcissus. Right. He looks at the image of himself in a pool, and he's so transfixed by his own image that he just kind of forgets the rest of the world. That's a narcissist. They're so caught up in themselves. Right. And in some cases, and in a lot of cases, it's feeling sorry for themselves, feeling, that they just kind of, other people just kind of become background noise. They don't matter. That's Kamala Harris. And her narcissism manifests itself in a way in which she is completely indifferent to how her actions affect other people.
So you talked about how Tulsi Gabbard basically kamikazed Kamala Harris's 2020 campaign. She was going to have very limited time on that debate stage, and she chose to use it that way, even though Harris was not really in contention at that point. It had really already shaped up to be a race between Biden and Bernie. And you attribute that actually to her military background. And again, one of these deeper struggles that's going on between different elements of the deep state. So let's take a look at that knockout punch, and then we'll talk about why she did that.
Confronting Vice President Biden at the last debate, you called it a, quote, false accusation that Joe Biden is a racist. What's your response?
I want to bring the conversation back to the broken criminal justice system that is disproportionately negatively impacting Black and brown people all across this country today. Now, Senator Harris says she's proud of her record as a prosecutor and that she'll be a prosecutor president, but I'm deeply concerned about this record. There are too many examples to cite, but she put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep cash bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Senator Harris, your response?
All right. And her response really goes to your point. You can see she has a personality
Attorney General
disorder.
of California, I did the work of
significantly reforming the criminal justice system of a state of 40 million people, which became a national model for the work that needs to be done. And I am proud of that work. And I am proud of making a decision to not just give fancy speeches or be in a legislative body and give speeches on the floor, but actually doing the work of being in the position to use the power that I had to reform a system that is badly in need of reform. That is why we created initiatives that were about reentering former offenders and getting them counseling. It is why, and because I know that criminal justice system is so broken, that I am an advocate for what we need to do to not only decriminalize, but legalize marijuana in the United States.
I want to bring Congresswoman Gabbard back in. Your response, ma'am?
The bottom line is, Senator Harris, when you are in a position to make a difference and an impact in these people's lives, you did not. And worse yet, in the case of those who were on death row, innocent people, you actually blocked evidence from being revealed that would have freed them until you were forced to do so. There is no excuse for that. And the people who suffered under your reign as prosecutor, you owe them an apology.
I haven't been crazy about her work lately, but I can't take that away from her.
No, you certainly can't.
So can you talk about what you mean when you say it's not an accident that somebody coming from the military would have decided to take out Harris because there are elements in the Pentagon that don't like this Clintonian State Department agenda?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you say you don't particularly like her work lately, because I agree with you, and we know what that's about, which is about her position on Israel-Palestine. But that actually matches what I'm about to lay out, because I think that Tulsi Gabbard represents a similar faction to General Michael Flynn and other people that were in the Trump camp that come out of the Pentagon. And their attitude is that Russia can be a very useful ally in fighting Islamic extremism and terrorism. And they were critical of U.S. foreign policy in Syria, because in Syria you had a secular government, you know, the Ba'athist Arab socialist government led by Bashar Assad, where Christians and Muslims and Alawites were living side by side. And the people trying to overthrow it were people with the Al-Qaeda, you know, Wahhabi ideology. And so Tulsi Gabbard went to Syria. She met with the Syrian Social Nationalist Party and with the Syrian president, was widely attacked for doing that. And there was a feeling that, no, we don't want to overthrow the Syrian Arab Republic because it would be replaced with something that would be a fountainhead of terrorism and would lead to more 9/11s and more ISIS, etc. And that Russia has been dealing with Islamic extremism for quite some time. I mean, we know Osama bin Laden launched his career in Afghanistan fighting the Soviet Union, and the Chechen separatists funded by Saudi Arabia and funded and backed by the United States government are something that Russia's had to deal with. You know, Russia is of all the countries in the world that are not Muslim countries, Russia has the most Muslims. Now, I've heard some people say maybe India has more, but it's close. And that, you know, that there are a lot of Muslims in Russia, and Putin is very popular among Muslims in Russia. But, you know, when it comes to people that have been backed by the United States or backed by outside actors to try and overthrow Russia, Islamic extremist forces have been a big part of it. And so Russia is very good at tracking those folks. So much so that when the Boston bombing happened, Russia pointed out they had warned the American government about the Tsarnaev brothers. Because they were Chechens. They were Chechen, and they were tied to Chechen separatism. Their parents had fought against the Soviet Union, and that they had been monitoring. They'd seen them in online web forums and stuff, and they knew those Tsarnaev brothers were potentially dangerous, and that there are a lot of people in the military who joined because they don't want things like 9/11 to happen, right? They honestly believe they want to keep us safe, right? And then when Obama was president, they very much saw that U.S. foreign policy was not about keeping us safe. In fact, we were giving guns and weapons to the very ideology that they were trying to protect us from. I remember I was at a protest in 2013 in Washington, D.C., when they were preparing, you know, there was the possibility of bombing Syria after the allegations of a chemical weapons attack. There was a woman who walked up to the protests and she said, "I agree with you guys. I'm an FBI Arab translator." And she gives us a thumbs up because she's listening. She can hear in these tapes they're playing of the glorious Syrian rebels. She knows what they're chanting, and they're chanting things like "death to Christians," you know, death to Alawites. You know, I mean, these were not fighters for democracy and freedom. They were extremists. Well, Tulsi Gabbard, Michael Flynn, and there's a number of voices in the Pentagon that you can think of that feel this way. And of course, that would also translate to a position of supporting Israel against the Palestinians. You see the Palestinians as Muslim terrorists. So it kind of matches what you're saying about Tulsi Gabbard, and that there's a fear that if there's another Arab Spring, if there's another effort to bring down a bunch of these populist governments like Anne Marie Slaughter, the intellectual behind the Hillary Clinton State Department, wants to do, the result will be more refugees, more instability, and more chaos. The Libyan intervention, I really wish people could wrap their minds around what happened in Libya in 2011. Libya was the most prosperous country on the African continent, the highest life expectancy. They had built the world's largest irrigation system, the Great Man-Made River. They had wiped out illiteracy. They had done amazing things. Gaddafi, the leader of this anti-colonial revolution, he had nationalized the oil, and he was using the oil money to build Libya up into a prosperous country. And then a protest movement started, and they bombed Libya, and now that country is in complete and utter chaos. How long has it been since 2011? The country is, it's still a mess.
Slave
and
markets.
People die trying to get out of Libya in the Mediterranean. They drown in the Mediterranean trying to die. And like you said, modern day slave markets. Like what happened in Libya, which Samantha Power and Cass Sunstein and Ben Rhodes brag about how they convinced Barack Obama to do it reluctantly. What happened there was atrocious. And Barack Obama even said when he was leaving office, his greatest regret as president was going into Libya, he said, without a clear plan. It was an absolute disaster, and the beneficiaries of it were largely terrorist groups. ISIS recruited heavily out of those forces, the Al-Qaeda wing of things. I mean, it was a disaster, and terrorism and weapons and all kinds of things spread throughout the African continent. And when we talk about personalities, Ben Rhodes, in his memoir of the Obama presidency, describes pretty well how they got Obama to do it. And they said, to Obama that when, that Benghazi was the city that had been seized by the rebels. And Gaddafi had said us in a speech, he said, when we retake Benghazi, we're going to go house to house. Now, he meant we're going to track down the rebels and the terrorists. But they told Barack Obama when he said house to house, they meant they were going to kill every person in the city. He was going to commit genocide. And they worked on Barack Obama for 3 days, saying there's going to be a genocide. Gaddafi's going to kill every single person in Benghazi, and you're going to be remembered as the guy who didn't stop it. The first black president didn't stop a genocide in Africa. Oh, my goodness. And, and they worked on him. And I think his damage about having watched his stepfather, Lolo Soetoro, beat his mother, Ann Dunham, and not being able to do anything about it because he was a child probably had a lot to do with the buttons that they pushed. And that they knew how to work on Barack Obama, and they got Barack Obama to do something that he later greatly regretted, which has had catastrophic consequences for the world. So knowing how to push the buttons and knowing how to psychoanalyze the person who's in the Oval Office is quite important.
Tusker, you had a question.
Yeah, and this is kind of more broad because one of the reasons why I'm excited that your book has kind of caught on is for exactly this reason. It's not just about Kamala Harris. It's about a much deeper analysis of politics and the class forces behind and all those interests. But I did just want to ask you in general about anti-imperialism. Why has anti-imperialism historically been such a core component of class politics? And what is the difference between being anti-war and being anti-imperialist?
Well, my understanding is that imperialism refers to a system. Capitalism in its monopolistic stage. And it's very interesting because that is the classical Marxist-Leninist understanding, right? Lenin talks about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And what really defines imperialism is holding back economic development. It's preventing countries from being able to take control of their own economy and resources, and instead having what he calls the export of capital, where instead of, it used to be we exported tires or we exported cars. Now we export the corporation, right? McDonald's is spread all over the world. We don't export French fries, we export McDonald's, right? And it's about the export of capital and preventing countries from developing their own industries and keeping countries in poverty, holding back economic development. Now, that was the understanding that the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union had. And that's why right after the Bolsheviks took power, they gave military support to the Emir of Afghanistan. And he was a conservative monarchist, but he was fighting the British Empire. And they said, that works for us. And they convened the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku. And they said, hey, if you're going to fight the British Empire, we're with you because imperialism is the enemy. And when you talk about being a component of class politics, you can even go back to Marx, right? In Marx's day, Ireland was fighting for its independence. And Karl Marx, he wrote a very important letter where he said the duty of working class radicals and Marxists and socialists in Britain is to support the Irish freedom struggle everywhere and to get the English workers to see the victory of the Irish people against the British Empire, not as a question of abstract justice, but as a matter of their own liberation, right? I think A.J. Musty, who was a kind of a Christian socialist pacifist, he would say our real enemy is at home. And that is what anti-imperialism is. It's the understanding that these countries around the world that are struggling against the domination of big banks and corporations from the West are our allies in the struggle against the big corporations here, right? And that ultimately, we don't have an interest in helping, ExxonMobil, BP, and Bank of America take over the world. And in fact, we're getting screwed by Bank of America and ExxonMobil right here. And so we have a common interest with people around the world that are struggling against them. Now, that was the classical Marxist-Leninist understanding, but I've been to Iran where they are definitely not Marxists. They are very religious. But, they studied Lenin in Iran and they studied the economics of imperialism. And, Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, he talked about American economic imperialism. And the Bolivarian countries, they are socialists, but they incorporate Roman Catholicism, indigenous ideology. They have this understanding. And you go around the world today, the classic Soviet-style Marxism is not really in fashion anymore. But this understanding of what imperialism is and that it's a system, that is very much the global understanding. And I do maintain that understanding. I'm at the point where, it's funny, I wrote this book 4 years ago. I don't call myself a communist as much now because, I know what I believe. My beliefs haven't changed. But if you say communist now, people think you're woke. And I'm not. I'm not woke. And I've been to communist countries. They are not woke. But if it used to be in America, if I told people I was a communist, they would say, how could you be that? And I could say, well, let me tell you all about it. Nowadays, if I tell people I'm a communist, they go, oh, I know what you are. You're 17, you have purple hair, and you think all Republicans are Nazis, and you're obsessed with the trans thing. That ain't me. That's not what I believe. And it ain't what they believe in Venezuela. It's not what they believe in Vietnam. It's not what they believe in China. It's not what the countries around the world struggling against imperialism believe. So the term that I've started to use to describe myself, I say that I am an innovationist. Because if you look at the world, right, the underlying question, and this is what that last 10 pages that you didn't get to, Russell, are about, is that human beings... That's
what I said, the reveal.
Yeah, human beings are creative creatures. We are constantly reinventing our relationship with our environment. And human technology, we're constantly moving to a higher plane. Ants have been building their ant farms the same way for thousands of years. Beavers have been making their beaver dams the same way for thousands of years. But in just 7,000 or 8,000 years, we've gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to space travel, to iPhones, to artificial intelligence. We constantly reinvent our relationship with Mother Nature to make it serve us in a more efficient way, to expand our population, to increase our life expectancy, to make life more comfortable. That is the nature of what it means to be a human being, as we're constantly trying to expand. And right now we are in a crisis because human brilliance has outstripped the narrow horizons, the narrow limits of production organized for profit. And what we need is a rationally organized economy so we can keep inventing, keep expanding, keep having our life expectancy grow, keep expanding our population. Well, taking it back to that Eastern establishment, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the British Empire, they say that the solution right now is that we have to degrow. We have to reduce consumption because the problem is that there's too many people. They are not Marxists. They are Malthusians, right? They blame the economic crisis that we're in the world on overpopulation. And that their solution to save the global economic system and conveniently let them stay at the top of it is to prevent growth around the world. And they see anti-imperialist countries that have broken out of their system, as the main target. Because what are they doing? They're growing. That's what they do. When countries break out of Western domination and imperialism, they start growing and building and electrifying and wiping out illiteracy and bringing their people up. And that is seen as a threat to the environment. And Biden openly said so when he was running for president. If you read his essay, America Must Lead Again, he said, we're going to stop China from building power plants in Africa, right? That's what they want. To save their system, they want degrowth. And that is what fascism is. And that is what fascism has always been. Fascism is not an aesthetic. Fascism is not being racist. People have been racist before. People have been militaristic and authoritarian before. Fascism is when, in a long-term economic crisis, the government kind of locks down society and forcibly degrows, right? They created a slave labor underclass in Nazi Germany. They forced women out of the workforce to get rid of unemployment. They rebooted the economy by creating, lots of military spending. Fascist economics is trying to save the capitalist system with forcible, heavy-handed degrowth. And I must say, I agree with a lot of what Trumper folks say, but they seem to think that this Malthusianism from the World Economic Forum and all of that is Marxism and communism. And I have the painful and difficult task of saying, well, actually, it's not. And if you go to any Marxist or communist country, that's clearly not the case. But that is what the woke people believe. And a lot of them think they're Marxists. So I can understand why you're confused, right? And I can understand why it's confusing. And also, let me add that socialism in our time and anti-imperialism, a really big part of it nowadays is small business owners, right? Vietnam, the way they've had their economic miracle is with their enabling people to start their own businesses. They call it a socialist-oriented market economy. Nicaragua, I've been there. I was an elections monitor there. They have what they call a micro entrepreneurship program where the government loans money to people to start their own businesses, worker cooperatives, and that is the strength of their socialist economy in Nicaragua. And the 21st century socialism is all about enabling people to start their own business and be creative and all of that, and subsidizing them in doing so in coordination with an overall planned economy. So the state is kind of making sure there's constantly growth. And then what is the ultimate goal? Is a world with so much growth and so much wealth that the need for a government can fade away, that people can just do what they feel like doing. Labor becomes life's prime want, meaning people work to entertain themselves, to get joy from being creative, not because it's a necessity. A society where there's so much wealth and abundance that there's really no need for anyone to hoard anything, and everyone's pretty much equal because there's enough for everybody. That's the ultimate goal. And Marx talked about the higher stage of communism. He's talking of a world of vast wealth and vast abundance, right? And so I tell people I'm an innovationist because I believe innovation is the essence of what I'm for. I believe in human beings and our creative power. And I believe that we can revolutionize our relationship with the environment and get to a higher plane. And, I think that's what it means to be a socialist or a communist in our time, but that's not what it means to most people. So I now, my organization is called the Center for Political Innovation, and I'm saying I'm an innovationist.
Well, I think something most people, I myself didn't really know this until I got to know more communists. They tend to be pro-growth and pro-industry and pro-innovation and pro-technology. And I think that's very different from the idea that people have of them. And in keeping with what you got into with this kind of long-term social engineering project towards accommodating people to degrowth. I'm very curious what your take on this is. Now, I am completely supportive of trans rights, gay rights. It's not about that. We've gone beyond that to promotion, as we'll get into later with our Olympics segment. Do you think that's a degrowth strategy?
I don't know if I would call it degrowth. One thing I will say is, my understanding of the Marxist understanding of the family is that Marx dissects, he talks about how there's base and superstructure, right? And that all the institutions kind of reflect the underlying economic system, right? Under feudalism, we had absolute monarchies. Hunter-gatherer civilization, we lived in tribes. Capitalism, we have liberal democratic republics. And that there's nothing like eternal. Right? There's no sacred way of doing things. And I remember when I was a kid growing up, I would see people, they had this bumper sticker and it would say marriage equals one man plus one woman. And I would have a Bible verse. And I would always laugh about that. And I'd say, funny, how many wives did Moses have? How many wives did Ezekiel have? How many, read the Old Testament. Those guys, wasn't one man plus one woman. It was one man plus many, many women. And that, the family has changed. And under hunter-gatherer civilization, the whole tribe was kind of a family. And then you have polygamy, and now we have monogamy, and now we're increasingly having gay marriage. And in the idea that there's this magical sacred way that it always is, Marx kind of takes that apart. And that's the Marxist teaching of the family. That's it, right? And it's the understanding that as society changes, the family will also change. But it's important to note that in the Soviet Union, they were all about family values. There was the Soviet family before the nuclear family, right? And they outlawed homosexuality, they outlawed abortion, and they were encouraging, they gave a medal to women who had more than 10 children. And the Soviet Union, starting around 1927, they got to be rather socially conservative out of necessity. You had a population there, a largely peasant population that had been very conservative and very religious. And yes, you had the Bolsheviks who were these radical. They were trying to do the free love, abolish marriage thing for a while, but it wasn't going to work. And Stalin was kind of the compromise. He was a Bolshevik, but he was from Georgia. He grew up in a small village. His father made shoes for a living, and he could do both. He was a good speaker and a writer, but he was also from the people. He was a mass organizer. And Stalin, his leadership was kind of a compromise between the deep conservatism of the Russian people and the radical leftism of the Bolsheviks and the Marxist movement. And communism in the 20th century was this kind of weird merger of deep conservatism and radical leftist economics that worked out very well and enabled a lot of countries to electrify and industrialize and get over that first hurdle of becoming modern countries. So when it comes to the trans rights thing, I don't think it's a degrowth agenda. I don't think there's enough trans people that are losing their fertility, that it's about reducing the population. I think it is a way to be radical and not change anything when it really gets down to it, right? If we're changing the way we look at gender, if we're changing that, we're not challenging the power of big corporations. We're not restructuring the wage system. We're not cutting into the power of any rich people. We're just kind of, figuring out how to get people to think about things differently. And I mean, I will also say that, the trans thing, my heart goes out to anyone who goes through that. I've known people who go through that, and it's very difficult, and they need, love and kindness. And I respect them and their doctors making the choices they want to make. You have to admit there's a lot of money to be made off that. There's a lot of money to be made off of that. And that's what makes me suspicious. And the other thing that I am a little bit suspicious of is, while I have always been against bullying, I have always been in favor of giving people love and letting people be who they are. It is weird that there's this demand. And I remember when the left became kind of wokeified, every leftist space, every meeting must start with pronouns, it's never enough. You can say, I support trans rights, and then you have 100 people tweeting at you about how you said it the wrong way and you're a bad person. I mean, it's nuts.
Yes, and you get into that more broadly, not specifically around that issue, but you get into how part of this kind of effort by the intelligence services was to create a left that puts on the affectations of radicalism without it being directed towards any destabilizing purpose. And it seems like that's very much where we are now. Now, you talked about Trump at one point as another version of the cruel narcissism that you see in Kamala Harris. Now, I saw you on Kim Iverson. You said that you've changed some of your opinions about Trump. I don't know if that's one of them. So what did you mean? Do you stand by that?
Well, we've learned a lot about Trump since he left office, right? I will say what I took Trump to task for in the book, I do stand by. I took him to task over his rhetoric around immigrants and his use of this, the lyrics to this jazz song about, the snake, and kind of, I felt it was almost like a warning against compassion. It was like saying compassion is weakness. I referenced Ayn Rand, and I have always found that aspect of the right wing to be particularly disturbing. This idea that if you care about other people, you want to help other people, you're a weak person, the virtue of selfishness, etc. But I will say, when it comes to foreign policy, Trump did a lot of bad things as president, murdering Qasem Soleimani, bringing us to the brink of war with Iran, moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, but now we're starting to learn that, one of the people who was very much key in pushing Trump to do those things was a guy named John Bolton. And John Bolton, is somebody who eventually turned against Trump. Now he says he supports Trump again, but he betrayed Trump. Trump sees him. And Mike Pompeo also. Supported the prosecution of Donald Trump, supported the raid on Mar-a-Lago, and that Mike Pompeo and, John Bolton and the people that were pushing Trump to do these bad things, they're the ones that turned against him. The other thing is, when it comes to Venezuela, for example, right? Trump was not good to Venezuela, but he finally just said, I'm tired of this. I want to move on. After the food truck, do you remember that, right? So all the anti-Venezuelan folks, they had a food truck on the border, and they were going to cross the border, and then they lit it on fire themselves. It was a false flag. And Max Blumenthal caught it on video and showed that, no, they lit their own food truck on fire. And after that, Donald Trump was kind of like, you know what? I'm bored of Venezuela. Can we just not talk about this? And of course, the deep state folks were like, what? No, what do you mean? Overthrowing Venezuela is what we're all about. And he's like, yeah, I'm just kind of bored about this. And I think Trump noticed it wasn't a big winner in the polls. Well, it might win him points in Miami. With most Americans, they're not sitting there going, I sure wish the president would overthrow the government of Venezuela. That's what I want, and that Donald Trump, when it really gets down to it, Donald Trump is, I think, in a lot of ways a narcissist, but his narcissism is our best hope right now. He is thinking, how am I going to be remembered, especially now that he's getting older? If he has a second term, he's thinking, how are they going to look back on me in history? He wants to be remembered as a guy who did good things for the country, who made peace. That's why he was so desperate to go to North Korea and meet with Kim Jong-un. I think you guys are out in L.A. Are you out in L.A., Los Angeles?
No. I'm in New York. She's in Arkansas.
Okay. Yeah.
And
well,
Keaton's upstate.
I was out in L.A. A couple months ago. I gave a talk at Los Angeles Family Church. That's a church that was very supportive of peace on the Korean Peninsula, and they invited me out there. And I mean, this is a church that's very anti-communist historically, but they gave me the podium to give a talk about the potential for peace on the Korean Peninsula in a second Trump administration. I was really honored to go out there and speak to a crowd of people of different backgrounds and others out there in Los Angeles. And that Trump wants to be remembered as a guy who made peace. Kamala has attacked Trump for meeting with Kim Jong-un. She called it a photo op. It was horrible. How dare he? Donald Trump wants to be remembered as a guy who made peace. One thing I will say about Trump, and I think this is interesting, is that Nixon was president when Donald Trump was kind of in his formative years. And Donald Trump kind of wants to be Nixon, which is interesting because Nixon actually did a lot of good things as president. Now, he did a lot of bad things too. He crushed the Black freedom struggle. He, bombed Vietnam massively, but then he pulled out of Vietnam.
Wow.
And he lowered the voting age to 18. And he created the Office of Workplace Health and Safety. And, Richard Nixon actually enacted a lot of policies that were quite beneficial because he was trying to hold the country together. And he even advocated a guaranteed minimum income for all citizens. Yep. And he held on to that even into his second term. He was advocating that. And it was pretty clear that when he was ousted, the replacement of Richard Nixon by Gerald Ford, that's where Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney first got into D.C. That's also where Ayn Rand came to the White House with Alan Greenspan. And Alan Greenspan had his first job, the guy who went on to, wreck our economy in 2008. And that the overthrow of Richard Nixon was a victory for neoliberal economics, right? The Milton Friedman, privatize everything. It's always better. Hey, what's the problem with having prisons for profit? People getting paid for people getting locked up. What could possibly go wrong, right? And why not have private companies wage our wars, right? We don't need a military. Let's have private companies go and wage our wars. What could possibly go wrong with that? That kind of thinking really took effect after Nixon was ousted. So that's kind of important to keep in mind. But Nixon, when he met with Mao Zedong, he went to China, he said to Mao that no Democrat could do what he did because they would be called a communist. And Mao said to Nixon, he said, "You're a rightist." He said, "I like rightists." That's a quote from Mao Zedong. "I like rightists." And what he meant was, when I sit down with a rightist, they tell me what they really believe. And when I sit down with these liberals, they give me a two-faced song and dance that's, dreamed up in a strategic institute. So I think it's very interesting. Look, Trump could be a lot worse in his second term, but he could potentially be a lot better. We will have to see. I think there's a very good chance that Trump will win the upcoming election if it's a fair election. So, I think anything would be better than Kamala Harris. I'll give you my opinion right there, but I'm not going to endorse a lot of things Trump says and does. So there you go.
All right. So let's end on an observation about Kamala Harris. See if you can give us some hope. I'm gonna read one more thing from your book here. There's your observation of the modern left, or part of it. In the absence of class solidarity and economic, what is that? Okay, of socialism as central planning and construction, many have voted that leftism has largely, thank you there, Jake, economic notions of socialism as central planning and construction. Many have noted that leftism has largely degenerated to a form of victimology. Various forms of oppression, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, mistreatment of the disabled, and body shaming are denounced and studied in great depth. In left-wing discourse, individuals are given permission to feel that they have been victimized for this unfairness and unleash their rage. They get to satisfy their impulse toward aggression by exacting revenge for their perceived oppression. So this is not only your analysis of the modern so-called left, that's pretty much your analysis of Kamala Harris. And I think part of why you are so vehement that she must not come into power. But now I look around at who the people are who think of themselves as left, and they are all, as you describe, there. Is there any hope of rebuilding a left that has class and economic analysis? Because that has just been crushed. There are so few people who think of themselves as left who have anything to say about economics or class anymore.
There's always been two souls of what you might call the left. There's been a populist soul, and there has been a intellectual, middle-class, nonconformist soul. And that's always been just a reality of what leftist politics means. This whole notion of left and right, it comes from the French Revolution. After the revolution, they created a National Assembly. People who are still loyal to the king sat on the right, and the more radical people who embraced the French Revolution, the Jacobins and others, they sat on the left. And that became a designation. And I think the unleashing of impulses, the libidinal release, it was very effective in bringing down feudalism. Feudalism is a very controlled society. You know, the peasant can't even look the landlord in the face. There's different words that they use. It's a very hierarchical, traditional way where people are kind of holding themselves in, not expressing their true feelings, certainly not releasing their sexual impulses. And the French Revolution comes along and it says, let it all out, right? The world's been unfair to you. Rise up and revolt. And the color red becomes associated with it because what's red the color of, right? It's the color of sexual passion. It's the color of rage and anger. And that unleashing people's libido, I guess you could call it, was a very effective mechanism for bringing down feudalism. But in our time, that has now become the main tool that the imperialists use in destabilizing the world. That's what the Hillary Clinton State Department was doing with Facebook and Twitter. They were using Facebook and Twitter to give people permission to unleash their rage and tear down, governments all over the world. And I talk a lot, especially in the third chapter of the book, about another Freudian concept they talk about parental transference. Right. And, it seems like, when you're a child, the most important relationship you have is with your parents. Right. And that affects your relationship with people throughout your life as you'll project your parents onto other people. But I think what a lot of people in the country right now are longing for is a president that they could look up to like a good father would be. And I talk about Roosevelt and I talk about Lincoln and how, they projected a very, very different vibe. One thing I didn't mention in the book, but it's important to discuss is that, Franklin Roosevelt, this great president, who was a social reformer, was probably the most socialist friendly president we ever had. He met with communist labor organizers at the White House and, he enabled his wife to go forward and talk about Jim Crow at a time where that was completely taboo. And, Roosevelt would not have been who he was. He was a child of wealth and privilege from a very powerful family, but he went to a boarding school in New England that was run by a man named Endicott Peabody, who ran this very effective boarding school for boys. And Endicott Peabody was what they called a Christian socialist. He was a Christian and a socialist. He wasn't a Marxist, but he was an advocate of Christian socialism. And as a young man, Roosevelt was, sent out to do charity work. He was taught the value of having compassion and empathy for other people. And I think the Roosevelt presidency can largely be seen as a result, in some ways, of his relationship with Endicott Peabody. Endicott Peabody presided over Roosevelt's marriage. He also presided over a church service during Roosevelt's inaugurations. And that he had this relationship with his, school headmaster, who was a Christian socialist for his whole life. And that, words like Christian socialist, that would seem like almost an oxymoron nowadays, right? Socialist is supposed to mean you just want rebellion or whatever. But that used to be a very common thing in the United States. The Pledge of Allegiance was written by a Christian socialist, Francis Bellamy. He wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. And if the words of the Pledge of Allegiance were actually considered, they were a giant FU to the Confederacy. Right? I pledge allegiance to the flag in the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, like no confederacy, one nation, indivisible, like no confederacy, with liberty and justice for all, i.e. no slaves. It was designed to be a giant FU to the Confederacy, and it was written by a socialist. So the idea that you can love your country, that you can have Christian faith and advocate a socialist planned economy, that didn't used to be something that people considered to be off limits. And, I think we need to re-examine what left and right really mean. I always considered myself to be of the left. I grew up in a conservative small town surrounded by Bush supporters and conservatives, and I was very opposed to that. But, over the last few years, I've gotten to the point where I am a conservative person, but I don't believe in the free market. I don't believe in capitalism, and I certainly don't believe in imperialism. And there's a lot of interesting ideas around the world. Our understanding of politics in America is very shallow. Right? I mean, right. Dinesh D'Souza does these documentaries about every bad person in history who was actually a Democrat.
Right.
It's very silly, right? It's like you can be a liberal or a conservative. It's like politics is much bigger than that. Alexander Dugin, for example, right? He's this Russian thinker who's an advisor to Russian President Putin. I've met Alexander Dugin. Alexander Dugin, he talks about what he calls the fourth political theory. And he has an understanding that draws heavily from both the left and the right, trying to develop an alternative to the Western system. And if you look at China today, Mao hated Confucius. Confucius was a symbol of, authoritarianism and filial piety and all this. And, but now they've got statues of Confucius and statues of Mao almost right next to each other because they're both part of China's battlefields of the Donbass right now. They've got tanks where they've got this Orthodox flag with an icon of Jesus on it, and they've got the hammer and sickle of the old Soviet Union right next to each other because they're both part of Russia, a civilization that's been around for, thousands of years, and Stalin and the great czars and Ivan the Terrible and Alexander Nevsky and all of that are part of the outside of 20th century political boxes because we need to save our country. I love my country. I do love my country. I don't love the government. I don't love, what it does around the world in terms of militarism, but I love the people here. And I think our ultimate interest is building a new America outside of the rule of big banks and corporations, an America where the economy is organized as expression of patriotism. Put me in whatever category you want. That's what I want. I want the best for my country. You can't be an internationalist without being a patriot, because if you want what's best for the world, that means you want what's best for your country because your country is part of the world. And you can't be a patriot to be getting along with other countries and treating them fairly. So there is no contradiction between patriotism and internationalism, right? It's national chauvinism, thinking your country is better than some other country. That's one thing. And I don't like that. We always say, this is the greatest country in the world. That's a rather vulgar thing that we say. As for my country, in the context of wanting a better world, I think that walks hand in hand. So those are my thoughts, and that's the perspective from which I wrote this book. I will end by saying this. I don't know what the next shoe to drop on this book is, right? Because this is weird. The fact that I don't know what the next shoe to drop is. I've been to Russia a number of times. I work at RT, but I'll tell you, I wrote this all by myself. No Russian had anything to do with this book. This book is not Russian propaganda. And the Russian friends I have, if I had gone to them and said, hey, I'm doing this, they would have tried to stop me. I can almost guarantee you they would have said, don't publish that. Don't rock the boat. So that maybe the next shoe to drop is that this is all a big Kremlin conspiracy to rig our elections or something like that. Well, first of all, I wrote it 4 years ago, right? And I didn't change anything, and they just took it down now. So I would have had to have conspired.
Joy Reid has told us the Russians can time travel.
Okay.
They went back and altered her old blog post to put in homophobia.
There you go.
So, you might be in with those time traveling Russians.
Well, there you go. Well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for having me on. I really did enjoy it.
Thank you. I knew we would find the uplift. The uplift at the end.
Yes.
Caleb, get in your plugs. Where can people find?
I'm a member of the Center for Political Innovation. It's the think tank or education project we started. Our website is cpiusa.org, Center for Political Innovation. Trying to spread the word about opposing war, 4-point plan to rescue the country. That's where you can find my stuff. I've got a website, calebmaupin.net. I'm streaming on YouTube a lot, and I'm out there. So thank you again for having me on.
Thank you very much, Caleb.
Thanks, Caleb.
That was fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you again soon. Thank you. All right, Jake, throw up the link for the book while it's top of mind. All right, so that is where you can get.
Yeah, did you guys get it? Right fast.
And there's Caleb's book. That was really, really an interesting interview. We're going to have more people on who are going to talk anti-imperialism and theory. All right, so let's get to some super chats. We got quite a lot of them, and everyone don't forget.
Russell, while you're doing that, I'm going to try. I've been having like a really nasty delay in my headsets. I'm going to try to switch out my headphones and see if that will correct my problem. So I don't.